Italian fascism, also known as classical fascism or simply fascism, is the original fascist ideology as developed in Italy by Giovanni Gentile and Benito Mussolini. The ideology is associated with a series of two political parties led by Benito Mussolini, the National Fascist Party, which ruled the Kingdom of Italy from 1922 until 1943, and the Republican Fascist Party that ruled the Italian Social Republic from 1943 to 1945. Italian fascism is also associated with the post-war Italian social movement and subsequent Italian neo-fascist movements. Italian fascism was rooted in Italian nationalism, national syndicalism, revolutionary nationalism, and the desire to restore and expand Italian territories, which Italian fascists deemed necessary for a nation to assert its superiority and strength and to avoid succumbing to decay. Italian fascists also claimed that modern Italy was the heir to ancient Rome and its legacy, and historically supported the creation of an imperial Italy to provide spazio vitale for colonization by Italian settlers and to establish control over the Mediterranean Sea. Italian fascism promoted a corporatist economic system whereby employer and employee syndicates are linked together in associations to collectively represent the nation's economic producers and work alongside the state to set national economic policy. This economic system intended to resolve class conflict through collaboration between the classes. Italian fascism opposed liberalism, especially classical liberalism, which fascist leaders denounced as the debacle of individualism. Fascism was opposed to socialism because of the latter's frequent opposition to nationalism, but it was also opposed to the reactionary conservatism developed by Joseph de Maistre. It believed the success of Italian nationalism required respect for tradition and a clear sense of a shared past among the Italian people, alongside a commitment to a modernized Italy. Originally, many Italian fascists were opposed to Nazism, as fascism in Italy did not espouse Nordicism and did not initially espouse the anti-Semitism inherent in Nazi ideology, although many fascists, in particular Mussolini himself, held racist ideas that were enshrined into law as official policy over the course of fascist rule. As Fascist Italy and Nazi Germany grew politically closer in the latter half of the 1930s, Italian laws and policies became explicitly anti-Semitic due to pressure from Nazi Germany, including the passage of the Italian racial laws. When the fascists were in power, they also persecuted some linguistic minorities in Italy. In addition, the Greeks in Dodecanese and northern Epirus, which were then under Italian occupation and influence, were persecuted. Etymology. The Italian term fascismo is derived from fascio, meaning bundle of sticks, ultimately from the Latin word fasces. This was the name given to political organizations in Italy known as fasci, groups similar to guilds or syndicates. According to Italian fascist dictator Benito Mussolini's own account, the Fasces of Revolutionary Action were founded in Italy in 1915. In 1919, Mussolini founded the Italian Fasces of Combat in Milan, which became the National Fascist Party 2 years later. The fascists came to associate the term with the ancient Roman fasces or fascio littorio, a bundle of rods tied around an axe, an ancient Roman symbol of the authority of the civic magistrate carried by his lictors, which could be used for corporal and capital punishment at his command. The symbolism of the fasces suggested strength through unity. A single rod is easily broken, while the bundle is difficult to break. Similar symbols were developed by different fascist movements. For example, the phalange symbol is 5 arrows joined by a yoke. Definitions. Historians, political scientists, and other scholars have long debated the exact nature of fascism. Historian Ian Kershaw once wrote that trying to define fascism is like trying to nail jelly to the wall. Each different group described as fascist has at least some unique elements, and many definitions of fascism have been criticized as either too broad or too narrow. According to many scholars, fascism, especially once in power, has historically attacked communism, conservatism, and parliamentary liberalism, attracting support primarily from the far right. Frequently cited as a standard definition by notable scholars, such as Roger Griffin, Randall Schweller, Bo Rothstein, Federico Finkelstein, and Stephen D. Shenfield, is that of historian Stanley G. Payne. Payne's definition of fascism focuses on three concepts: fascist negations, anti-liberalism, anti-communism, and anti-conservatism. Fascist goals: the creation of a nationalist dictatorship to regulate economic structure and to transform social relations within a modern, self-determined culture, and the expansion of the nation into an empire. Fascist style: a political aesthetic of romantic symbolism, mass mobilization, a positive view of violence, and promotion of masculinity, youth, and charismatic authoritarian leadership. In his book How Fascism Works, The Politics of Us and Them, Jason Stanley defined fascism as a cult of the leader who promises national restoration in the face of humiliation brought on by supposed communists, Marxists, and minorities and immigrants who are supposedly posing a threat to the character and the history of a nation, and that the leader proposes that only he can solve it and all of his political opponents are enemies or traitors. Stanley says recent global events as of 2020, including the pandemic and the protests, have substantiated his concern about how fascist rhetoric is showing up in politics and policies around the world. Historian John Lukács argues that there is no such thing as generic fascism. He claims that Nazism and communism are essentially manifestations of populism, and that states such as Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy are more different than similar. Roger Griffin describes fascism as a genus of political ideology whose mythic core in its various permutations is a palingenetic form of populist ultranationalism. Griffin describes the ideology as having three core components: the rebirth myth, populist ultranationalism, and the myth of decadence. In Griffin's view, fascism is a genuinely revolutionary, trans-class form of anti-liberal, and in the last analysis, anti-conservative nationalism built on a complex range of theoretical and cultural influences. He distinguishes an interwar period in which it manifested itself in elite-led but populist armed party politics opposing socialism and liberalism, and promising radical politics to rescue the nation from decadence. Kershaw argues that the difference between fascism and other forms of right-wing authoritarianism in the interwar period is that the latter generally aimed to conserve the existing social order, whereas fascism was revolutionary, seeking to change society and obtain total commitment from the population. In Against the Fascist Creep, Alexander Reed Ross writes regarding Griffin's view, following the Cold War and shifts in fascist organizing techniques, a number of scholars have moved toward the minimalist new consensus refined by Roger Griffin. The mythic core of fascism is a populist form of palingenetic ultranationalism. That means that fascism is an ideology that draws on old, ancient, and even arcane myths of racial, cultural, ethnic, and national origins to develop a plan for the new man. Griffin himself explored this mythic or eliminable core of fascism with his concept of post-fascism to explore the continuation of Nazism in the modern era. Additionally, other historians have applied this minimalist core to explore proto-fascist movements. Mudd and Cristobal Rovira Kaltwasser argue that although fascism flirted with populism, in an attempt to generate mass support, it is better seen as an elitist ideology. They cite in particular its exaltation of the leader, the race, and the state, rather than the people. They see populism as a thin-centered ideology with a restricted morphology that necessarily becomes attached to thick-centered ideologies such as fascism, liberalism, or socialism. Thus populism can be found as an aspect of many specific ideologies, without necessarily being a defining characteristic of those ideologies. They refer to the combination of populism, authoritarianism, and ultranationalism as a marriage of convenience. Robert Paxton says, a form of political behavior marked by obsessive preoccupation with community decline, humiliation, or victimhood, and by compensatory cults of unity, energy, and purity, in which a mass-based party of committed nationalist militants, working in uneasy but effective collaboration with traditional elites, abandons democratic liberties and pursues with redemptive violence and without ethical or legal restraints goals of internal cleansing and external expansion. Roger Eatwell defines fascism as an ideology that strives to forge social rebirth based on a holistic national radical third way, while Walter Laqueur sees the core tenets of fascism as self-evident: nationalism, social Darwinism, racialism, the need for leadership, a new aristocracy and obedience, and the negation of the ideals of the Enlightenment and the French Revolution. Racism was a key feature of German fascism, for which the Holocaust was a high priority. According to the historiography of genocide, in dealing with the Holocaust, it is the consensus of historians that Nazi Germany targeted Jews as a race, not as a religious group. Umberto Eco, Kevin Passmore, John Weiss, Ian Adams, and Moira Grant stress racism as a characteristic component of German fascism. Historian Robert Saucy stated that Hitler envisioned the ideal German society as a Volksgemeinschaft, a racially unified and hierarchically organized body in which the interests of individuals would be strictly subordinate to those of the nation, or folk. Kershaw noted that common factors of fascism included the cleansing of all those deemed not to belong: foreigners, ethnic minorities, undesirables, and belief in its own nation's superiority, even if it was not biological racism like in Nazism. Fascist philosophies vary by application, but remain distinct by one theoretical commonality: all traditionally fall into the far-right sector of any political spectrum, catalyzed by afflicted class identities over conventional social inequities. Position in the political spectrum. Scholars place fascism on the far right of the political spectrum. Such scholarship focuses on its social conservatism and its authoritarian means of opposing egalitarianism. Roderick Stack Elberg places fascism, including Nazism, which he says is a radical variant of fascism, on the political right by explaining, the more a person deems absolute equality among all people to be a desirable condition, the further left he or she will be on the ideological spectrum. The more a person considers inequality to be unavoidable or even desirable, the further to the right he or she will be. Fascism's origins are complex and include many seemingly contradictory viewpoints, ultimately centered on a mythos of national rebirth from decadence. Fascism was founded during World War I by Italian national syndicalists who drew upon both left-wing organizational tactics and right-wing political views. Italian fascism gravitated to the right in the early 1920s. A major element of fascist ideology that has been deemed to be far-right is its stated goal to promote the right of a supposedly superior people to dominate, while purging society of supposedly inferior elements. In the 1920s, the Italian fascists described their ideology as right-wing in the political program The Doctrine of Fascism, stating, "We are free to believe that this is the century of authority, a century tending to the right, a fascist century." Mussolini stated that fascism's position on the political spectrum was not a serious issue for fascists. Fascism, sitting on the right, could also have sat on the mountain of the center. These words in any case do not have a fixed and unchanged meaning, they do have a variable subject to location, time, and spirit. We don't give a damn about these empty terminologies, and we despise those who are terrorized by these words. Major Italian groups politically on the right, especially rich landowners and big business, feared an uprising by groups on the left, such as sharecroppers and labor unions. They welcomed fascism and supported its violent suppression of opponents on the left. The accommodation of the political right into the Italian fascist movement in the early 1920s created internal factions within the movement. The fascist left included Michele Bianchi, Giuseppe Bottai, Angelo Oliviero Olivetti, Sergio Panunzio, and Edmond de Rossini, who were committed to advancing national syndicalism as a replacement for parliamentary liberalism in order to modernize the economy and advance the interests of workers and the common people. The fascist right included members of the paramilitary Black Shirts and former members of the Italian Nationalist Association. The Black Shirts wanted to establish fascism as a complete dictatorship, while the former ANI members, including Alfredo Rocco, sought to institute an authoritarian corporatist state to replace the liberal state in Italy while retaining the existing elites. Upon accommodating the political right, there arose a group of monarchist fascists who sought to use fascism to create an absolute monarchy under King Victor Emmanuel III of Italy. After the fall of the fascist regime in Italy, when King Victor Emmanuel III forced Mussolini to resign as head of government and placed him under arrest in 1943, Mussolini was rescued by German forces. While continuing to rely on Germany for support, Mussolini and the remaining loyal fascists founded the Italian Social Republic with Mussolini as head of state. Mussolini sought to re-radicalize Italian fascism, declaring that the fascist state had been overthrown because Italian fascism had been subverted by Italian conservatives and the bourgeoisie. Then the new fascist government proposed the creation of workers' councils and profit sharing in industry, although the German authorities, who effectively controlled northern Italy at this point, ignored these measures and did not seek to enforce them. A number of post-World War II fascist movements described themselves as a third position outside the traditional political spectrum. Falange Española de los Junts leader José Antonio Primo de Rivera said, "Basically the right stands for the maintenance of an economic structure, albeit an unjust one, while the left stands for the attempt to subvert that economic structure, even though the subversion thereof would entail the destruction of much that was worthwhile." Fascist/I is a pejorative. None. History. Background and 19th century roots. Georges Valois, founder of the first non-Italian fascist party Fascio, claimed the roots of fascism stemmed from the late 18th century Jacobin movement, seeing in its totalitarian nature a foreshadowing of the fascist state. Historian Georges Moss similarly analyzed fascism as an inheritor of the mass ideology and civil religion of the French Revolution, as well as a result of the brutalization of societies in 1914–1918. Historians such as Irene Collins and Howard C. Payne see Napoleon III, who ran a police state and suppressed the media, as a forerunner of fascism. According to David Thompson, the Italian Risorgimento of 1871 led to the nemesis of fascism. William L. Shirer sees a continuity from the views of Fichte and Hegel, through Bismarck, to Hitler. Robert Gerwarth speaks of a direct line from Bismarck to Hitler. Julian Dierks sees fascism as a particularly violent form of imperialism. Span I fin de siècle/I/span era and fusion of more racism with Sorlianism. None. Fascist syndicalism. World War I and its aftermath. At the outbreak of World War I in August 1914, the Italian political left became severely split over its position on the war. The Italian Socialist Party opposed the war, but a number of Italian revolutionary syndicalists supported war against Germany and Austria-Hungary on the grounds that their reactionary regimes had to be defeated to ensure the success of socialism. Angelo Oliviero Olivetti formed a pro-interventionist fascio called the Revolutionary Fasces of International Action in October 1914. Benito Mussolini, upon being expelled from his position as chief editor of the size newspaper Avanti for his anti-German stance, joined the interventionist cause in a separate fascio. The term fascism was first used in 1915 by members of Mussolini's movement, the Fasces of Revolutionary Action. The first meeting of the Fasces of Revolutionary Action was held on January 24, 1915, when Mussolini declared that it was necessary for Europe to resolve its national problems, including national borders of Italy and elsewhere, for the ideals of justice and liberty for which oppressed peoples must acquire the right to belong to those national communities from which they descended. Attempts to hold mass meetings were ineffective and the organization was regularly harassed by government authorities and socialists. Similar political ideas arose in Germany after the outbreak of the war. German sociologist Johann Plenge spoke of the rise of a National Socialism in Germany within what he termed the ideas of 1914 that were a declaration of war against the ideas of 1789. According to Plenge, the ideas of 1789 such as the rights of man, democracy, individualism, and liberalism were being rejected in favor of the ideas of 1914 that included German values of duty, discipline, law and order. Plenge believed that racial solidarity would replace class division and that racial comrades would unite to create a socialist society in the struggle of proletarian Germany against capitalist Britain. He believed that the spirit of 1914 manifested itself in the concept of the People's League of National Socialism. This National Socialism was a form of state socialism that rejected the idea of boundless freedom and promoted an economy that would serve the whole of Germany under the leadership of the state. This National Socialism was opposed to capitalism because of the components that were against the national interest of Germany but insisted that National Socialism would strive for greater efficiency in the economy. Plenge advocated an authoritarian rational ruling elite to develop National Socialism through a hierarchical technocratic state. Impact of World War I. Impact of the Bolshevik Revolution. Fascist Manifesto and Charter of Carnero. From populism to conservative accommodations. Fascist violence. Fascist Italy. Historian Stanley G. Payne says, primarily political dictatorship. The fascist party itself had become almost completely bureaucratized and subservient to, not dominant over, the state itself. Big business, industry, and finance retained extensive autonomy, particularly in the early years. The armed forces also enjoyed considerable autonomy. The fascist militia was placed under military control. The judicial system was left largely intact and relatively autonomous as well. The police continued to be directed by state officials and were not taken over by party leaders, nor was a major new police elite created. There was never any question of bringing the church under overall subservience. Sizable sectors of Italian cultural life retained extensive autonomy, and no major state propaganda and culture ministry existed. The Mussolini regime was neither especially sanguinary nor particularly repressive. Mussolini in power. Catholic Church. Corporatist economic system. Aggressive foreign policy. Hitler adopts Italian model. International impact of the Great Depression and build-up to World War II. The conditions of economic hardship caused by the Great Depression brought about an international surge of social unrest. According to historian Philip Morgan, the onset of the Great Depression was the greatest stimulus yet to the diffusion and expansion of fascism outside Italy. Fascist propaganda blamed the problems of the long depression of the 1930s on minorities and scapegoats, Judeo-Masonic Bolshevik conspiracies, left-wing internationalism, and the presence of immigrants. In Germany, it contributed to the rise of the Nazi Party, which resulted in the demise of the Weimar Republic and the establishment of the fascist regime, Nazi Germany, under the leadership of Adolf Hitler. With the rise of Hitler and the Nazis to power in 1933, liberal democracy was dissolved in Germany and the Nazis mobilized the country for war, with expansionist territorial aims against several countries. In the 1930s, the Nazis implemented racial laws that deliberately discriminated against, disenfranchised and persecuted Jews and other racial and minority groups. Fascist movements grew in strength elsewhere in Europe. Hungarian fascist Gyula Gombos rose to power as Prime Minister of Hungary in 1932 and attempted to entrench his party of national unity throughout the country. He created an 8-hour workday and a 48-hour work week in industry, sought to entrench a corporatist economy, and pursued irredentist claims on Hungary's neighbors. The fascist Iron Guard movement in Romania soared in political support after 1933, gaining representation in the Romanian government, and an Iron Guard member assassinated Romanian Prime Minister Ion Duca. The Iron Guard was the only fascist movement outside Germany and Italy to come to power without foreign assistance. During the February 6, 1934 crisis, France faced the greatest domestic political turmoil since the Dreyfus Affair, when the fascist Francist movement and multiple far-right movements rioted en masse in Paris against the French government, resulting in major political violence. A variety of para-fascist governments that borrowed elements from fascism were formed during the Great Depression, including those of Greece, Lithuania, Poland, and Yugoslavia. In the Americas, the Brazilian integralists led by Plinio Salgado claimed as many as 200,000 members, although following coup attempts it faced a crackdown from the Estado Novo of Getulio Vargas in 1937. In Peru, the Fascist Revolutionary Union was a fascist political party which was in power 1931 to 1933. In the 1930s, the National Socialist Movement of Chile gained seats in Chile's parliament and attempted a coup d'état that resulted in the Seguro Obrero massacre of 1938. During the Great Depression, Mussolini promoted active state intervention in the economy. He denounced the contemporary supercapitalism that he claimed began in 1914 as a failure because of its alleged decadence, its support for unlimited consumerism, and its intention to create the standardization of humankind. Fascist Italy created the Institute for Industrial Reconstruction, a giant state-owned firm and holding company that provided state funding to failing private enterprises. The IRI was made a permanent institution in Fascist Italy in 1937, pursued fascist policies to create national autarky, and had the power to take over private firms to maximize war production. While Hitler's regime only nationalized 500 companies in key industries by the early 1940s, Mussolini declared in 1934 that 3/4 of Italian economy, industrial and agricultural, is in the hands of the state. Due to the worldwide depression, Mussolini's government was able to take over most of Italy's largest failing banks, who held controlling interest in many Italian businesses. The Institute for Industrial Reconstruction, a state-operated holding company in charge of bankrupt banks and companies, reported in early 1934 that they held assets of 48.5% of the share capital of Italy, which later included the capital of the banks themselves. Political historian Martin Blinkhorn estimated Italy's scope of state intervention and ownership greatly surpassed that in Nazi Germany, giving Italy a public sector second only to that of Stalin's Russia. In the late 1930s, Italy enacted manufacturing cartels, tariff barriers, currency restrictions, and massive regulation of the economy to attempt to balance payments. Italy's policy of autarky failed to achieve effective economic autonomy. Nazi Germany similarly pursued an economic agenda with the aims of autarky and rearmament, and imposed protectionist policies, including forcing the German steel industry to use lower quality German iron ore rather than superior quality imported iron. World War II. In Fascist Italy and Nazi Germany, both Mussolini and Hitler pursued territorial expansionist and interventionist foreign policy agendas from the 1930s through the 1940s, culminating in World War II. Mussolini called for irredentist Italian claims to be reclaimed, establishing Italian domination of the Mediterranean Sea and securing Italian access to the Atlantic Ocean, and the creation of Italian Spazio Vitale in the Mediterranean and Red Sea regions. Hitler called for irredentist German claims to be reclaimed, along with the creation of German Lebensraum in Eastern Europe, including territories held by the Soviet Union, that would be colonized by Germans. From 1935 to 1939, Germany and Italy escalated their demands for territorial claims and greater influence in world affairs. Italy invaded Ethiopia in 1935, resulting in its condemnation by the League of Nations and its widespread diplomatic isolation. In 1936, Germany remilitarized the industrial Rhineland, a region that had been ordered demilitarized by the Treaty of Versailles. In 1938, Germany annexed Austria and Italy assisted Germany in resolving the diplomatic crisis between Germany versus Britain and France over claims on Czechoslovakia by arranging the Munich Agreement that gave Germany the Sudetenland and was perceived at the time to have averted a European war. These hopes faded when Czechoslovakia was dissolved by the proclamation of the German client state of Slovakia, followed by the next day of the occupation of the remaining Czech lands and the proclamation of the German Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia. At the same time, from 1938 to 1939, Italy was demanding territorial and colonial concessions from France and Britain. In 1939, Germany prepared for war with Poland, but attempted to gain territorial concessions from Poland through diplomatic means. The Polish government did not trust Hitler's promises and refused to accept Germany's demands. The invasion of Poland by Germany was deemed unacceptable by Britain, France, and their allies, resulting in their mutual declaration of war against Germany that was deemed the aggressor in the war in Poland, resulting in the outbreak of World War II. In 1940, Mussolini led Italy into World War II on the side of the Axis. Mussolini was aware that Italy did not have the military capacity to carry out a long war with France or the United Kingdom and waited until France was on the verge of imminent collapse and surrender from the German invasion before declaring war on France and the United Kingdom on June 10, 1940, on the assumption that the war would be short-lived following France's collapse. Mussolini believed that following a brief entry of Italy into war with France, followed by the imminent French surrender, Italy could gain some territorial concessions from France and then concentrate its forces on a major offensive in Egypt where British and Commonwealth forces were outnumbered by Italian forces. Plans by Germany to invade the United Kingdom in 1940 failed after Germany lost the aerial warfare campaign in the Battle of Britain. In 1941, the Axis campaign spread to the Soviet Union after Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa. Axis forces at the height of their power controlled almost all of continental Europe. The war became prolonged contrary to Mussolini's plans, resulting in Italy losing battles on multiple fronts and requiring German assistance. During World War II, the Axis powers in Europe led by Nazi Germany participated in the extermination of millions of Poles, Jews, Gypsies, and others in the genocide known as the Holocaust. After 1942, Axis forces began to falter. In 1943, after Italy faced multiple military failures, the complete reliance and subordination of Italy to Germany, the Allied invasion of Italy and the corresponding international humiliation, Mussolini was removed as head of government and arrested on the order of King Victor Emmanuel III, who proceeded to dismantle the fascist state and declared Italy's switching of allegiance to the Allied side. Mussolini was rescued from arrest by German forces and led the German client state, the Italian Social Republic, from 1943 to 1945. Nazi Germany faced multiple losses and steady Soviet and Western Allied offensives from 1943 to 1945. On April 28, 1945, Mussolini was captured and executed by Italian communist partisans. On April 30, 1945, Hitler committed suicide. Shortly afterwards, Germany surrendered and the Nazi regime was systematically dismantled by the occupying Allied powers. An international military tribunal was subsequently convened in Nuremberg. Beginning in November 1945 and lasting through 1949, numerous Nazi political, military, and economic leaders were tried and convicted of war crimes, with many of the worst offenders being sentenced to death and executed. Post-World War II, the victory of the Allies over the Axis powers in World War II led to the collapse of many fascist regimes in Europe. The Nuremberg trials convicted several Nazi leaders of crimes against humanity involving the Holocaust. However, there remain several movements and governments that were ideologically related to fascism. Francisco Franco's Falangist one-party state in Spain was officially neutral during World War II, and it survived the collapse of the Axis powers. Franco's rise to power had been directly assisted by the militaries of Fascist Italy and Nazi Germany during the Spanish Civil War, and Franco had sent volunteers to fight on the side of Nazi Germany against the Soviet Union during World War II. The first years were characterized by a repression against the anti-fascist ideologies, deep censorship, and the suppression of democratic institutions. After World War II and a period of international isolation, Franco's regime normalized relations with the Western powers during the Cold War, until Franco's death in 1975 and the transformation of Spain into a liberal democracy. Historian Robert Paxton observes that one of the main problems in defining fascism is that it was widely mimicked. Paxton says, in fascism's heyday, in the 1930s, many regimes that were not functionally fascist borrowed elements of fascist decor in order to lend themselves an aura of force, vitality, and mass mobilization. He goes on to observe that Salazar crushed Portuguese fascism after he had copied some of its techniques of popular mobilization. Paxton says, where Franco subjected Spain's fascist party to his personal control, Salazar abolished outright in July 1934 the nearest thing Portugal had to an authentic fascist movement, Rolão Preto's blue-shirt national syndicalists. Salazar preferred to control his population through such organic institutions traditionally powerful in Portugal as the Church. Salazar's regime was not only non-fascist, but voluntarily non-totalitarian, preferring to let those of its citizens who kept out of politics live by habit. However, historians tend to view the Estado Novo as para-fascist in nature, possessing minimal fascist tendencies. Other historians, including Fernando Rosas and Manuel Villaverde Cabral, think that the Estado Novo should be considered fascist. In Argentina, Peronism, associated with the regime of Juan Perón from 1946 to 1955 and 1973 to 1974, was influenced by fascism. Between 1939 and 1941, prior to his rise to power, Perón had developed a deep admiration of Italian fascism and modeled his economic policies on Italian fascist policies. However, not all historians agree with this identification, which they consider debatable or even false, biased by a pejorative political position. Other authors, such as the Israeli Ronan Rain, categorically maintain that Perón was not a fascist and that this characterization was imposed on him because of his defiant stance against U.S. hegemony. The term neo-fascism refers to fascist movements after World War II. In Italy, the Italian social movement led by Giorgio Almirante was a major neo-fascist movement that transformed itself into a self-described post-fascist movement called the National Alliance, which has been an ally of Silvio Berlusconi's Forza Italia for a decade. In 2008, and joined Forza Italia in Berlusconi's new party the People of Freedom, but in 2012 a group of politicians split from the People of Freedom, refounding the party with the name Brothers of Italy. In Germany, various neo-Nazi movements have been formed and banned in accordance with Germany's constitutional law which forbids Nazism. The National Democratic Party of Germany is widely considered a neo-Nazi party, although the party does not publicly identify itself as such. Contemporary fascism. Greece. Post-Soviet Russia. Tenets. Robert O. Paxton finds that even though fascism maintained the existing regime of property and social hierarchy, it cannot be considered simply a more muscular form of conservatism because fascism in power did carry out some changes profound enough to be called revolutionary. These transformations often set fascists into conflict with conservatives rooted in families, churches, social rank, and property. Paxton argues that fascism redrew the frontiers between private and public, sharply diminishing what had once been untouchably private. It changed the practice of citizenship from the enjoyment of constitutional rights and duties to participation in mass ceremonies of affirmation and conformity. It reconfigured relations between the individual and the collectivity, so that an individual had no rights outside community interest. It expanded the powers of the executive party and state in a bid for total control. Finally, it unleashed aggressive emotions hitherto known in Europe only during war or social revolution. Nationalism with or without expansionism. Ultranationalism, combined with the myth of national rebirth, is a key foundation of fascism. Robert Paxton argues that a passionate nationalism is the basis of fascism, combined with a conspiratorial and Manichaean view of history which holds that the chosen people have been weakened by political parties, social classes, unassimilable minorities, spoiled rentiers, and rationalist thinkers. Roger Griffin identifies the core of fascism as being palingenetic ultranationalism. The fascist view of a nation is of a single organic entity that binds people together by their ancestry and is a natural unifying force of people. Fascism seeks to solve economic, political, and social problems by achieving a millenarian national rebirth, exalting the nation or race above all else and promoting cults of unity, strength, and purity. European fascist movements typically espouse a racist conception of non-Europeans being inferior to Europeans. Beyond this, fascists in Europe have not held a unified set of racial views. Historically, most fascists promoted imperialism, although there have been several fascist movements that were uninterested in the pursuit of new imperial ambitions. For example, Nazism and Italian fascism were expansionist and irredentist. Falangism in Spain envisioned the worldwide unification of Spanish-speaking peoples. British fascism was non-interventionist, though it did embrace the British Empire. Totalitarianism. Fascism promotes the establishment of a totalitarian state. It opposes liberal democracy, rejects multi-party systems, and may support a one-party state so that it may synthesize with the nation. Mussolini's The Doctrine of Fascism, partly ghostwritten by philosopher Giovanni Gentile, who Mussolini described as the philosopher of fascism, states, "The fascist conception of the state is all-embracing. Outside of it no human or spiritual values can exist, much less have value." Thus understood, fascism is totalitarian, and the fascist state a synthesis and a unit inclusive of all values interprets, develops, and potentiates the whole life of a people. In The Legal Basis of the Total State, Nazi political theorist Carl Schmitt described the Nazi intention to form a strong state which guarantees a totality of political unity transcending all diversity in order to avoid a disastrous pluralism tearing the German people apart. Fascist states pursued policies of social indoctrination through propaganda in education and the media, and regulation of the production of educational and media materials. Education was designed to glorify the fascist movement and inform students of its historical and political importance to the nation. It attempted to purge ideas that were not consistent with the beliefs of the fascist movement and to teach students to be obedient to the state. Economy. Fascism presented itself as an alternative to both international socialism and free market capitalism. While fascism opposed mainstream socialism, fascists sometimes regarded their movement as a type of nationalist socialism to highlight their commitment to nationalism, describing it as national solidarity and unity. Fascists opposed international free market capitalism, but supported a type of productive capitalism. Economic self-sufficiency, known as autarky, was a major goal of most fascist governments. Fascist governments advocated for the resolution of domestic class conflict within a nation in order to guarantee national unity. This would be done through the state mediating relations between the classes. While fascism was opposed to domestic class conflict, it was held that bourgeois-proletarian conflict existed primarily in national conflict between proletarian nations versus bourgeois nations. Fascism condemned what it viewed as widespread character traits that it associated as the typical bourgeois mentality that it opposed, such as materialism, crassness, cowardice, and the inability to comprehend the heroic ideal of the fascist warrior, and associations with liberalism, individualism, and parliamentarianism. In 1918, Mussolini defined what he viewed as the proletarian character, defining proletarian as being one and the same with producers, a productivist perspective that associated all people deemed productive, including entrepreneurs, technicians, workers and soldiers as being proletarian. He acknowledged the historical existence of both bourgeois and proletarian producers but declared the need for bourgeois producers to merge with proletarian producers. Because productivism was key to creating a strong nationalist state, it criticized internationalist and Marxist socialism, advocating instead to represent a type of nationalist productivist socialism. Nevertheless, while condemning parasitical capitalism, was willing to accommodate productivist capitalism within it so long as it supported the nationalist objective. The role of productivism was derived from Henri de Saint-Simon, whose ideas inspired the creation of utopian socialism and influenced other ideologies, that stressed solidarity rather than class war and whose conception of productive people in the economy included both productive workers and productive bosses to challenge the influence of the aristocracy and unproductive financial speculators. Saint-Simon's vision combined the traditionalist right-wing criticisms of the French Revolution with a left-wing belief in the need for association or collaboration of productive people in society. Whereas Marxism condemned capitalism as a system of exploitative property relations, fascism saw the nature of the control of credit and money in the contemporary capitalist system as abusive. Unlike Marxism, fascism did not see class conflict between the Marxist-defined proletariat and the bourgeoisie as a given or as an engine of historical materialism. Instead, it viewed workers and productive capitalists in common as productive people who were in conflict with parasitic elements in society including corrupt political parties, corrupt financial capital and feeble people. Fascist leaders such as Mussolini and Hitler spoke of the need to create a new managerial elite led by engineers and captains of industry but free from the parasitic leadership of industries. Hitler stated that the Nazi Party supported Bodenständigen Kapitalismus that was based upon profit earned from one's own labor, but condemned unproductive capitalism or loan capitalism, which derived profit from speculation. Fascist economics supported a state-controlled economy that accepted a mix of private and public ownership over the means of production. Economic planning was applied to both the public and private sector, and the prosperity of private enterprise depended on its acceptance of synchronizing itself with the economic goals of the state. Fascist economic ideology supported the profit motive, but emphasized that industries must uphold the national interest as superior to private profit. While fascism accepted the importance of material wealth and power, it condemned materialism, which identified as being present in both communism and capitalism, and criticized materialism for lacking acknowledgement of the role of the spirit. In particular, fascists criticized capitalism, not because of its competitive nature nor support of private property, which fascists supported, but due to its materialism, individualism, alleged bourgeois decadence and alleged indifference to the nation. Fascism denounced Marxism for its advocacy of materialist internationalist class identity, which fascists regarded as an attack upon the emotional and spiritual bonds of the nation and a threat to the achievement of genuine national solidarity. In discussing the spread of fascism beyond Italy, historian Philip Morgan states, since the Depression was a crisis of laissez-faire capitalism and its political counterpart, parliamentary democracy, fascism could pose as the third-way alternative. Between capitalism and Bolshevism, the model of a new European civilization. As Mussolini typically put it in early 1934, from 1929, fascism has become a universal phenomenon. The dominant forces of the 19th century, democracy, socialism, liberalism, have been exhausted. the new political and economic forms of the 20th century are fascist. Fascists criticized egalitarianism as preserving the weak, and they instead promoted social Darwinist views and policies. They were in principle opposed to the idea of social welfare, arguing that it encouraged the preservation of the degenerate and the feeble. The Nazi Party condemned the welfare system of the Weimar Republic, as well as private charity and philanthropy, for supporting people whom they regarded as racially inferior and weak, and who should have been weeded out in the process of natural selection. Nevertheless, faced with the mass unemployment and poverty of the Great Depression, the Nazis found it necessary to set up charitable institutions to help racially pure Germans in order to maintain popular support, while arguing that this represented racial self-help and not indiscriminate charity or universal social welfare. Thus, Nazi programs such as the Winter Relief of the German People and the broader National Socialist People's Welfare were organized as quasi-private institutions, officially relying on private donations from Germans to help others of their race, although in practice those who refused to donate could face severe consequences. Unlike the social welfare institutions of the Weimar Republic and the Christian charities, the NSV distributed assistance on explicitly racial grounds. It provided support only to those who were racially sound, capable of and willing to work, politically reliable, and willing and able to reproduce. Non-Aryans were excluded, as well as the work-shy, asocials and the hereditarily ill. Under these conditions, by 1939, over 17 million Germans had obtained assistance from the NSV, and the agency projected a powerful image of caring and support for those who were judged to have got into difficulties through no fault of their own. Yet the organization was feared and disliked among society's poorest because it resorted to intrusive questioning and monitoring to judge who was worthy of support. Action. Fascism emphasizes direct action, including supporting the legitimacy of political violence, as a core part of its politics. Fascism views violent action as a necessity in politics that fascism identifies as being an endless struggle. This emphasis on the use of political violence means that most fascist parties have also created their own private militias. The basis of fascism's support of violent action in politics is connected to social Darwinism. Fascist movements have commonly held social Darwinist views of nations, races, and societies. They say that nations and races must purge themselves of socially and biologically weak or degenerate people, while simultaneously promoting the creation of strong people, in order to survive in a world defined by perpetual national and racial conflict. Age and gender roles. Fascism emphasizes youth both in a physical sense of age and in a spiritual sense as related to virility and commitment to action. The Italian fascists' political anthem was called Giovinezza. Fascism identifies the physical age period of youth as a critical time for the moral development of people who will affect society. Walter Laqueur argues that corollaries of the cult of war and physical danger were the cult of brutality, strength, and sexuality, a true counter-civilization, rejecting the sophisticated rationalist humanism of old Europe. Fascism sets up as its ideal the primitive instincts and primal emotions of the barbarian. Italian fascism pursued what it called moral hygiene of youth, particularly regarding sexuality. Fascist Italy promoted what it considered normal sexual behavior in youth while denouncing what it considered deviant sexual behavior. It condemned pornography, most forms of birth control and contraceptive devices, homosexuality, and prostitution as deviant sexual behavior, although enforcement of laws opposed to such practices was erratic and authorities often turned a blind eye. Fascist Italy regarded the promotion of male sexual excitation before puberty as the cause of criminality amongst male youth, declared homosexuality a social disease and pursued an aggressive campaign to reduce prostitution of young women. Mussolini perceived women's primary role as primarily child-bearers, while that of men as warriors, once saying, "War is to man what maternity is to the woman." In an effort to increase birth rates, the Italian fascist government gave financial incentives to women who raised large families and initiated policies intended to reduce the number of women employed. Italian fascism called for women to be honored as reproducers of the nation, and the Italian fascist government held ritual ceremonies to honor women's role within the Italian nation. In 1934, Mussolini declared that employment of women was a major aspect of the thorny problem of unemployment, and that for women, working was incompatible with childbearing. Mussolini went on to say that the solution to unemployment for men was the exodus of women from the workforce. The German Nazi government strongly encouraged women to stay at home to bear children and keep house. This policy was reinforced by bestowing the Cross of Honor of the German Mother on women bearing 4 or more children. The unemployment rate was cut substantially, mostly through arms production and sending women home so that men could take their jobs. Nazi propaganda sometimes promoted premarital and extramarital sexual relations, unwed motherhood, and divorce, but at other times the Nazis opposed such behavior. The Nazis decriminalized abortion in cases where fetuses had hereditary defects or were of a race the government disapproved of, while the abortion of healthy pure German, Aryan fetuses remained strictly forbidden. For non-Aryans, abortion was often compulsory. Their eugenics program also stemmed from the progressive biomedical model of Weimar Germany. In 1935, Nazi Germany expanded the legality of abortion by amending its eugenics law, to promote abortion for women with hereditary disorders. The law allowed abortion if a woman gave her permission and the fetus was not yet viable and for purposes of so-called racial hygiene. The Nazis said that homosexuality was degenerate, effeminate, perverted and undermined masculinity because it did not produce children. They considered homosexuality curable through therapy, citing modern scientism and the study of sexology, which said that homosexuality could be felt by normal people and not just an abnormal minority. Open homosexuals were interned in Nazi concentration camps. Palingenesis and modernism. Fascism emphasizes both palingenesis and modernism. In particular, fascism's nationalism has been identified as having a palingenetic character. Fascism promotes the regeneration of the nation and purging it of decadence. Fascism accepts forms of modernism that it deems promotes national regeneration while rejecting forms of modernism that are regarded as antithetical to national regeneration. Fascism aestheticized modern technology and its association with speed, power, and violence. Fascism admired advances in the economy in the early 20th century, particularly Fordism, and scientific management. Fascist modernism has been recognized as inspired or developed by various figures such as Filippo Tommaso Marinetti, Ernst Jünger, Gottfried Benn, Louis Ferdinand Céline, Knut Hamsun, Ezra Pound, and Wyndham Lewis. In Italy, such modernist influence was exemplified by Marinetti, who advocated a palingenetic modernist society that condemned liberal bourgeois values of tradition and psychology, while promoting a technological martial religion of national renewal that emphasized militant nationalism. In Germany, it was exemplified by Jünger, who was influenced by his observation of the technological warfare during World War I and claimed that a new social class had been created that he described as the warrior worker. Like Marinetti, Jünger emphasized the revolutionary capacities of technology. He emphasized an organic construction between human and machine as a liberating and regenerative force that challenged liberal democracy, conceptions of individual autonomy, bourgeois nihilism, and decadence. He conceived of a society based on a totalitarian concept of total mobilization of such disciplined warrior workers. Fascist aesthetics. According to cultural critic Susan Sontag, fascist aesthetics flow from a preoccupation with situations of control, submissive behavior, extravagant effort, and the endurance of pain. They endorse two seemingly opposite states, egomania and servitude. The relations of domination and enslavement take the form of a characteristic pageantry, the massing of groups of people, the turning of people into things, the multiplication or replication of things, and the grouping of people/things around an all-powerful, hypnotic leader figure or force. The fascist dramaturgy centers on the orgiastic transactions between mighty forces and their puppets, uniformly garbed and shown in ever-swelling numbers. Its choreography alternates between ceaseless motion and a congealed, static, virile posing. Fascist art glorifies surrender, it exalts mindlessness, it glamorizes death. Sontag also enumerates some commonalities between fascist art and the official art of communist countries, such as the obeisance of the masses to the hero, and a preference for the monumental and the grandiose and rigid choreography of mass bodies. But whereas official communist art aims to expound and reinforce a utopian morality, the art of fascist countries such as Nazi Germany displays a utopian aesthetics that of physical perfection, in a way that is both prurient and idealizing. According to Sontag, fascist aesthetics is based on the containment of vital forces, movements are confined, held tight, held in. Its appeal is not necessarily limited to those who share the fascist political ideology because fascism stands for an ideal or rather ideals that are persistent today under the other banners, the ideal of life as art, the cult of beauty, the fetishism of courage, the dissolution of alienation in ecstatic feelings of community, the repudiation of the intellect, the family of man. Criticism. Fascism has been widely criticized and condemned in modern times since the defeat of the Axis powers in World War II. Anti-democratic and tyrannical. One of the most common and strongest criticisms of fascism is that it is a tyranny. Fascism is deliberately and entirely non-democratic and anti-democratic. Unprincipled opportunism. Some critics of Italian fascism have said that much of the ideology was merely a byproduct of unprincipled opportunism by Mussolini and that he changed his political stances merely to bolster his personal ambitions while he disguised them as being purposeful to the public. Richard Washburn-Child, the American ambassador to Italy who worked with Mussolini and became his friend and admirer, defended Mussolini's opportunistic behavior by writing, "Opportunist is a term of reproach used to brand men who fit themselves to conditions for the reasons of self-interest. Mussolini, as I have learned to know him, is an opportunist in the sense that he believed that mankind itself must be fitted to changing conditions rather than to fixed theories, no matter how many hopes and prayers have been expended on theories and programs." Child quoted Mussolini as saying, "The sanctity of an ism is not in the ism, it has no sanctity beyond its power to do, to work, to succeed in practice. It may have succeeded yesterday and fail tomorrow. Failed yesterday and succeed tomorrow. The machine, first of all, must run." Some have criticized Mussolini's actions during the outbreak of World War I as opportunistic for seeming to suddenly abandon Marxist egalitarian internationalism for non-egalitarian nationalism and note, to that effect, that upon Mussolini endorsing Italy's intervention in the war against Germany and Austria-Hungary, he and the new fascist movement received financial support from Italian and foreign sources, such as Ansaldo and other companies as well as the British security service MI5. Some, including Mussolini's socialist opponents at the time, have noted that regardless of the financial support he accepted for his pro-interventionist stance, Mussolini was free to write whatever he wished in his newspaper Il Popolo d'Italia without prior sanctioning from his financial backers. Furthermore, the major source of financial support that Mussolini and the fascist movement received in World War I was from France and is widely believed to have been French socialists who supported the French government's war against Germany and who sent support to Italian socialists who wanted Italian intervention on France's side. Mussolini's transformation away from Marxism into what eventually became fascism began prior to World War I, as Mussolini had grown increasingly pessimistic about Marxism and egalitarianism while becoming increasingly supportive of figures who opposed egalitarianism, such as Friedrich Nietzsche. By 1902, Mussolini was studying Georges Sorel, Nietzsche, and Vilfredo Pareto. Sorel's emphasis on the need for overthrowing decadent liberal democracy and capitalism by the use of violence, direct action, general strikes, and neo-Machiavellian appeals to emotion impressed Mussolini deeply. Mussolini's use of Nietzsche made him a highly unorthodox socialist, due to Nietzsche's promotion of elitism and anti-egalitarian views. Prior to World War I, Mussolini's writings over time indicated that he had abandoned the Marxism and egalitarianism that he had previously supported in favor of Nietzsche's Übermensch concept and anti-egalitarianism. In 1908, Mussolini wrote a short essay called Philosophy of Strength based on his Nietzschean influence, in which Mussolini openly spoke fondly of the ramifications of an impending war in Europe in challenging both religion and nihilism. New kind of free spirit will come, strengthened by the war, a spirit equipped with a kind of sublime perversity, a new free spirit will triumph over God and over nothing.